get us together. Well, thank you very much for that effort to help, inform us as to how one goes about trying to understand these questions and how to solve them. Because I think you're right. I mean, as an academic, even though I participate in the community, we're all trained to think a certain way and we approach problems a certain way. And how do we take the knowledge and experiences of the entire community to be able to work through this? And so that's good. So we have a number of questions in our Q&A component. So I'll be reading those, and please, address them as you see. So the first one is, of those 4 approaches you talked about, which from your perspective is the most effective or important, if any?
I would say that it's all context dependent. So there are situations where the consultative approach is the most appropriate, as well as the contractual approach. It's incumbent upon the research team, I think, because they're the ones who are getting this funding. It should be incumbent upon them to understand the nature of the problem and to design a research approach that addresses the problem appropriately. They need to understand the they need to understand the stakeholders' needs. And, if it's just a matter of, hey, we need to know something about this particular plant and the possible impacts climate change might have on this plant, and here's the kind of information we need back, go and do good things. Well, that's pretty much just the consultative approach. And I'm sure that, that's great in some situations, but a lot of these problems are really complicated. Here's an example, one from Texas. The spot-tailed earless lizard is up for listing with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So they contracted with Texas A&M's, I think it's the Institute on the Environment is what they call it there at Texas A&M, to do some of this. No, I'm sorry, it wasn't Texas A&M. It was University of Texas that did this work. And anyway, what they found was that lizard, it occurs only in West Texas. It's accustomed to dry and hot conditions. Further dry and hot conditions probably won't harm it physiologically. But it needs open, sandy spaces on the ground to scurry about capturing prey. The problem that it's facing now is, as climate change proceeds, more and more invasive species are moving into its habitat. We're getting a lot of cheatgrass and other grasses that are not clump grasses. See, normally the native grasses that occurs around are clump grasses, so there's little spaces in between for the lizards to scurry through. Now you're getting grasses growing in between the clump grasses. It's changing their habitat. Now, this is an example, to me, this is an example of how difficult it can be to understand the whole of the ecosystem. Typical biologists would look at that and say, oh, lizard's going to be fine, because the physiology of the lizards can handle it. But it's not the physiology of the lizards that's the problem. It's the invasive species.
Right. So. Yeah, and it's the structure of that ecosystem and where habitats in which it's in makes a difference. Yeah.
Yep.
So to pick up on this, you're talking from this perspective, from the sort of vision of the researcher. In your experience, do you think there are stakeholders that also have that same, so I would call them blinders in terms of how they want, because we all try to address questions from our experiences and the way we've done things. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, how do you bridge where the experience of stakeholders come from in answering questions or wanting questions to be answered versus what the researchers do? Because oftentimes that history influences how one proceeds forward.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a real challenge. My immediate response is what someone put in my Mentimeter regarding how do you solve the climate change issue: conversation. Good communication, and spending some time with these people. Collaborative research takes more time. It really does. And that's one of the problems that we face at universities right now is our university reward system is largely based on the number of publications or the number of research dollars you crank out. And if you're doing work that takes more time, then your throughput, the number of publications you're getting out and the amount of money you're getting in can be impacted by that. And there's not a good system, or there are few, I should say, there are few good systems that reward this kind of research. But back to your point, and to directly answer it, I think it's all about conversations between the researchers and the stakeholders, and we try our best to facilitate that. If you were a smart skeptic listening to my presentation, you would say, why are you doing so many different things to try to make this work? And the reason is, one, different things are appropriate in different situations, and two, nothing works great all the time. Right. We haven't found a silver bullet.
Yeah.
So.
Very good. Well, thank you. So I'm going to go into our next question. And our next question is, so when the term participatory research is used, does it sort of blur across the various stakeholder models?
Yes, it does. Participatory research is pretty broad, and it can be any of those 4C things, the contractual, collaborative, consultative. What was the last one? I'm drawing a blank on it. Collegial, maybe.
Collegial. Mm-hmm.
It can draw on all those, and that is just one researcher's, Allison Meadows' approach to dividing it up. Other people would divide it up differently. So yeah, and again, it's all about the understanding the situation and designing the appropriate approach to it. I wish it was easy. I wish it was like, engineering with steel, and you could just say, well, you just cut it this long, and you do this kind of steel, and you heat it up just this way, and and it was working with people is never that way. It is messy. It is time consuming. It's hard. It really is.
And I think your point about universities not necessarily favoring that kind of approach because of how we judge productivity is a real issue. Yeah,
Yep.
I would agree. Okay, here's our next question. It's a good one too. How can an individual who is not a researcher or major stakeholder contribute to this process?
That's a challenge. If you're,
and let me finish. Yeah, excuse me. Let me finish it too, because it may shed. Perhaps work in tandem at the political activism level, like you just talked about. Any other roles that could be influential?
of course, if you're a part of a university, if you're an individual and you're part of a university, you could help out by trying to influence the reward system. It depends on your situation and who you have access to and the where you fit in the structure. But you might be able to, for example, a dean might be able to do something to help reward researchers for being active or actively participating in research that involves stakeholders. Well, certainly I can fall back on the old you can vote. That's something that every U.S. citizen just about can do. And by voting, I mean you can vote for candidates who support research funding, and another thing that you could do, even though you're not a major stakeholder. In my previous life, I worked with the with Oklahoma State University, and we had a contract with our state's water board, and we conducted the stakeholder input part of our state's revision of its water plan. So our state, just like Texas, has a comprehensive water plan. Every few years, it gets revised. And we went out and talked to citizens, and we had some 2,000 citizens participate over 2 years, and just asked them, the basic question we asked everybody was, what concerns you about water in Oklahoma? Now, I'm sure it will shock you to know that this was back in the late 2000s, so 2007 through 2011. And half of the comments that we got from people was they were concerned because Texas was suing us over water in the Red River Basin. But that's just a jab at Texas. We love to poke fun at you, those of us who are from Oklahoma. And I'm sure you do the same. But my point is, being involved in processes like that, you will hear politicians say all the time, at least in my state, they say, come down to our offices in the Capitol building and tell us what concerns you. Well, if I had lots of time, I might do that. And that's why they get a lot of retirees coming in to visit them. But I think it's incumbent on the legislators to go out and visit with people, but become involved in, politics or whatever. You can make a difference. You really can, because there's so few people these days who take the time to be involved. So.
And I think too, I mean, I was one of the persons that say be involved in that Menta for, part that you did. Because I think part of the difficulty, even what I see here in Lubbock, is people are aware, but they're not engaged. They figure someone else will do it. And then it never gets done, or it never gets moved to the degree it should. And so so to my response, I agree with you, is get involved in some way. You never know how that's going to influence how the process works.
Sure. Yep.
Very good. Okay, here's our next question. Not really related to stakeholder engagement, but you've mentioned tribal territory several times. I know many tribal areas experience some of the worst impacts of climate change. How can the common person support research or projects to help these tribes?
It's another really difficult one. You might just, approach the tribe and see if there's opportunities. You're going to have to build a relationship, and really the best way to do that, and this is my standard game plan for working with tribes, is if you don't know anybody at that tribe, find someone who does. And it works so much better if you come with someone who they trust. If you just show up, imagine me from the federal government showing up to a tribe that's never heard of me, never heard of a climate adaptation science center, and me sticking out my hand to, one of their managers and say, hi, I'm from the federal government and I'm here to help. That goes over real well with tribes. They've heard that before. They've been stabbed in the back. It's really bad. So find someone who knows someone within the tribe. And there, at least here in Oklahoma, there are plenty of academics who actually have ties to tribes that you could, visit with. And they, if you have good intentions and you're able to convince them of that, they might have a place for you to participate. But expect it to take a long time. Expect it to take years to build these relationships. It does not happen quickly. It really doesn't. And with good reason. I mean, they're very skeptical. In fact, here's an example of how difficult and how challenging this could be. We just hired a woman who has worked with a pueblo in New Mexico for over a decade. And she is very much accustomed to being a spokesman for environmental issues for her tribe. She was the director of environmental programs there, and we hired her away. She was in a couple of meetings where she really wanted to be able to say something on behalf of the tribe, but knew better of it. It's very difficult for her. And she had some conversations after that with her tribe, her former employer. And they said, no, absolutely. We realized that you were a part of this tribe, the tribal government for over 10 years, but you cannot, in any way say anything on our behalf at all, period, because you're not now. And so it's a very tight-knit, closely held, closely guarded community, and they are very careful about who they let in. They really are. So if you saw her, you would immediately recognize she's tribal. She looks tribal. She has a long tribal lineage. She's tribal through and through. But they did not want her to have to say anything because she had taken another job. So.
She doesn't represent them anymore.
Yep.
So we have a question from our old friend, Tony Clem.
Hi, Tony.
And Tony asked, it has to do with the fact that writing papers must take longer in collaborative kinds of environments. His question is, do you see a change in the understanding of success in academia by changing this approach?
Over my career, I have seen a small change in that not everyone, many people seem to be sympathetic that there needs to be a change. I do not hear many people saying, here's what the change needs to be. Now, believe it or not, I know this is hard to imagine, but the USGS might be ahead of academia in this realm, which is surprising to me. But within the USGS, we do have a large group of researchers. We're not just all administrators. We have a large group of researchers. And they are in a process that's similar to the academic promotion and tenure process. And, they come up before a board every few years to, ask for promotion or review their research in order for them to be promoted. And under the previous director of that review process, only number of publications and the robustness of those publications was considered. How influential you are in your field. That's what was considered, basically. However, that previous director has retired and a new one has taken over, and he has chosen to allow more flexibility in the review process, and they can consider stakeholder involvement as a positive thing when these scientists within the USGS are coming up for review. So that's a positive step. I know there are some academic colleges where this is considered, and there are some that are making progress along these lines. But boy, we got a long way to go.
So one of the other questions that has been asked is an interesting one, and it has to do with how do you decide who sits on your stakeholder board and science advisory to look at the questions? Could you speak a little bit about that?
That's a great question, and that's an important question. First of all, there is a federal law that governs this. It's called the Federal Advisory Committee Act, FACA, F-A-C-A. In order for us to have people on that committee that are not a part of a government, and a government is, federal government agency, state government agency, or tribal government, we have to get approval through a process, a federal government process, to have those people participate. So if there was somebody at a NGO, a non-governmental organization like the Nature Conservancy or Quail Unlimited or something like that, that wanted to participate, we would have to go through this very long and arduous process. Under the previous administration, in fact, one of the first things that President Trump did was to suspend all of the advisory committees, federal government-wide. And that went on through 2017. It wasn't until 2018 that we were even allowed to restart, and some of those committees never restarted. So how do we choose them? I pick, it's up to me, I select and invite folks who are part of these agencies to participate. I would love it if I could have NGOs participate too. And I would like to have some just average citizens, like farmers, for example, people who control, big pieces of land in our region. And a huge portion of our our region, which is New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana, it's like 95% is not controlled by the federal government, is privately owned. So if we want to work with the influential folks regarding the natural resources on those lands, we've got to work with private citizens like farmers and ranchers. I'd love to have several of them on our committee, but FACA precludes me from doing that. So yeah, we invite them. We invite them from all of the relevant federal agencies. We now have at least one from each of the from each of our states. Those are either the water agency in our state or the wildlife agency, the Fish and Wildlife Agency in our state. My goal this year is to have two from each state, one that comes from the water agency and one that comes from the Fish and Wildlife Agency in that state. So if you have a follow-up question, if I didn't really answer your question properly.
No, that was good. But and this is sort of a follow-up in another way. One of the issues that Texas has, and I think it's probably true of Oklahoma, a lot of the landowners in the state don't live in the state. They live out of the state. And so I guess, and so it's always a question for me and a frustration as to how do you deal with these people, because they are doing the management and the land development. But sometimes there's a buy-in and sometimes there is not. Obviously, for parts of Texas, it functions differently. I mean, the Hill Country has its own set of issues relating to landowners. You know, the Lubbock region, Southern High Plains, because of agriculture, is another issue. So, you know, I think one of the challenges is to how do you work with those groups, because they are all stakeholders in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah. I do not have a good answer for that, and it is way beyond the impact of absentee owners is way beyond just, you know, the land management issues. There's all kinds of issues there. So yeah, I really don't have an answer for that. I don't know what to do there.
So Michael, is that an issue too with water rights in Oklahoma? Dealing with, you know, from the absentee landowner issue?
Not so much. There's some, but it's mostly in little isolated areas where we have a few large absentee owners. Most of the folks here in Oklahoma, of course, our history is quite different. Our settlement history is quite different than Texas. People who, you know, were in the land run, they got 160 acres, if I remember right. Or maybe, no, it was a whole section, so 640 acres.
Right.
But maybe it was a quarter section. Dang it, I didn't go to high school here, so I don't have my good Oklahoma history down pat. I should be better at this. For some reason, it seems that they got a quarter section. I think they got a quarter section, 160 acres. And that tends to be about the maximum size of land holdings. In order to go beyond that in Oklahoma, you have to, you know, have a bunch of money and start buying up little, you know, chunks of land. Whereas, you know, Texas was settled in an entirely different way. And there's a lot of ranches in Texas that are a lot bigger than the ranches here in Oklahoma. So my point is, the small holdings here in Oklahoma favor small farmers and ranchers who are local. There are some cases where, yes, there's somebody, you know, in California or China or somewhere who owns the land and has an agricultural operation on it, but not as much here in Oklahoma as in Texas.
Yeah. So one question that came in, and I'm not aware, but you might be, is, are you aware of any tribal regions in Lubbock, West Texas area to get involved with? Yeah, I don't think there's anything around the Lubbock area.
I am not. My understanding is there's only 3 federally recognized tribes in Texas, 2 of which are kind of down in the southeast corner over by Louisiana, and then one kind of up close to Oklahoma on the eastern end of the Texas-Oklahoma border. So I don't think that there may be some state recognized tribes out west.
Yeah. I thought there was a pueblo, the Isleta Pueblo outside of El Paso, in that area there, but as far as I know, even living in Las Cruces, there's not been a lot of interaction with some of that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And all the tribes in Texas are pretty small. You know, they're not very, very populous at all.
So Michael, to finish this up, we have about 5 minutes left. There was a question that came in. Could you speak a little bit about what you, from your perspective, see as some of the one major challenging issues for each of the states dealing with climate adaptation, something that needs to be dealt with within this next, before 2030?
Okay. That's a great question, whoever asked it. What a good, insightful question. So, it's so different across the span of our region because we literally, think about it. We go from the swamps of southern Louisiana, where the Mississippi River hits the Gulf of Mexico, all the way up to the mountains of northern New Mexico. That's pretty different. And we've got desert too, right? So, in New Mexico, the big focus is on the Rio Grande and the impact of climate change on the snowpack. So I'm an Easterner. Even though I was born in California, I have lived most of my life in the humid eastern part of the United States. And the first time I went out west and stood in a desert and stood next to a river and realized that, the only source of water around here is this thin ribbon that's like 20 yards wide in front of me. And if this dries up, nobody has any water out here. That's the attitude there in New Mexico. Huge concern because of the way that there are a lot of compacts and legal agreements that govern, and legal precedent that governs the distribution of water in the Rio Grande. So as the snowpack shrinks, and as what snow is in those mountains in southern Colorado and northern New Mexico melts earlier, we're getting about the same amount of water flowing down the Rio Grande. It's just the timing is off for agricultural use. In Texas, there's of course the issues on the drier side of the state where you guys have been in drought out there pretty much almost continuously, I think, since since 2008 or 2010. I mean, it's been a long time when it's been dry out there.
Right.
That's tough. That's a tough environment to grow crops in, or any agriculture, and now it's even tougher. And then in Louisiana and the Texas coast, sea level rise is the big issue, of course, there. Huge issue there. In Oklahoma, it's the biggest issue is a lot like the western part of Texas. It's, things are changing out west. We're seeing a lot of dryness in western Oklahoma, and just like in the Texas Panhandle, and it's getting tough. If it wasn't for fracking, oil and gas, and the wind turbines out there, there'd be a lot more poverty out there. So it is getting tough. So those are the kinds of, just off the top of my head, those are the kinds of things that those states are dealing with, by and large, the big things.
So yeah, because the Texas Forest Service just moved a whole series of tankers flying airplanes into this region to deal with the fires that are north of us already that are moving through. And we're supposed to have a major fire weather day tomorrow as this front comes.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, so it's not very good. It's not very good.
Yep.
So, Michael, we have about a minute or so. Anything, I'd like you to just speak a little bit about where you see the Climate Center going in the next, little while. What do you see as some of the benefits and advantages that we can provide?
Well, the first thing to know is that the president and Congress have both proposed that for FY22, we would actually double our budget nationwide for all of the centers. There are 10 centers nationwide, and that the budget would be doubled for us nationwide. The budget has not been passed, as many of you all are aware, but when it does, we're anticipating that our budget would double, excuse me. That's scary because it's a lot of work, believe it or not, to spend all that money through research projects. It takes a lot of paperwork, a lot of tracking, a lot of getting people together to put those proposals together. It's a lot of work. The problem is we still have the same number of staff. So we were maxed out last year, and then they're going to double our work this year, maybe. So yeah, that's the big challenge. And then we hope that we can spend some of that money to add more staff. Those are the challenges, but the bureaucracy of the federal government moves very slow.
Well, very good. Well, we have come to our 6 o'clock hour. Michael, thank you very much for sharing all this. We've gotten some good comments in the questions, and I've gotten some text from some of the people watching here at Tech about how great it is. And so we appreciate the opportunity to do this at this time of the year. We also thank all of you that have joined us tonight